Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're watching this video. I'm coming to you from my office today, and we thought this would be a little different setting, maybe a little bit interesting. I hope that you and yours are doing well. Leanne and I are doing fine. Leanne is teaching. She's a middle school teacher. She's teaching from home on her computer. And we here at the office are keeping office hours as best we can. I am really missing our gatherings on Sundays and Wednesdays. I hope you are too. And I'm looking forward to the time we'll be back together. And I'm praying that that time will be soon. I'm not going to make any predictions when that time will come. We expect that it's definitely going to be through the month of April. And beyond that is anybody's guess. I hope that we'll be having church the first Sunday in May, but we'll have to wait and see. Anyhow, I want to share with you today another message from the book of Isaiah. This is Palm Sunday. April 5th is Palm Sunday. And so we're going to be looking at a passage in Isaiah chapter 6 that describes a vision that Isaiah received, a vision of Christ as he is seated in heaven. And it's a glorious vision, and we see him as the great King, the great God. And Palm Sunday is the day, of course, that we remember Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem when he offered himself as king to the nation of Israel, and they unfortunately rejected that offer. But we're going to see Christ as king in Isaiah chapter 6 today. So if you have a Bible handy, you may want to turn to that chapter with me. We know that it is Jesus that Isaiah sees in this video because the Apostle John, over in John chapter 12, he quotes something that Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 6. And John then says about that, he says, Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. And so this is Jesus and not God the Father that Isaiah is seeing in his vision. Another reason we know that it's Jesus and not the Father is because the Father himself says over in Exodus chapter 33 verse 20 that no one may see me and live. And in John chapter 6 verse 46, Jesus says no one has seen the Father. Except Jesus himself. And so, therefore, for all those reasons, we know that this is a vision of Jesus that Isaiah receives and not God the Father. And let's start out just by reading the entire passage. We're just going to look at the first 5 verses. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about it, look at it verse by verse. This is a truly, truly awesome vision of Christ seated on his throne in heavenly glory. Isaiah 6, beginning verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphs. Each had 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 wings they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is filled with his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Now, Isaiah's vision of Christ goes further than just those first 5 verses in chapter 6, but I want to concentrate just on those verses because they describe what Isaiah saw when he saw Christ in heaven. And it's just incredible. You know, only a handful of people in the Bible got to see Jesus in heaven like that, and Isaiah was one of them. And just think about this. Even in heaven, that is not a full revelation of Jesus' glory. Isaiah didn't see the full glory of Christ because no one can see Christ's full glory and live. No one can handle that. Christ's glory, God's glory is just too awesome. It's just too overpowering for us to be able to witness with our eyes in completeness. We couldn't handle that. And so that means that when you and I get to heaven someday, even there in heaven, we're going to see Christ. We're going to see God the Father, I assume. We'll see the Father. But that will be a toned down, somewhat limited vision of Christ we'll see because, again, Christ's glory is just too awesome for any created being, angel or human, to witness full on and survive. And that just makes me realize how awesome God is, how awesome and incredibly powerful, incredibly holy Christ is. Listen to how John MacArthur explains this. He said, even in heaven, we will see only a portion of God's glory. Certainly it will be a greater portion than anyone has ever seen in this world, but we won't see the incomprehensible, unimaginable glory of God in its entirety. The seraphim couldn't take it, so they covered their faces. And if the angelic beings can't look at God in His full glory, certainly we're not going to be able to either. And the point of that, though, is that God is so great and so awesome that we can't even imagine how powerful, how glorious He really is. He's just off the scales. God's glory, Christ's glory, is going to be so great that we'll never, ever, ever see it in its totality, even in eternity. And that does not mean that God is going to be hiding from us when we get to heaven, but it means that He's going to be protecting us from something that we couldn't handle. Okay, so let's go back now and let's unpack this passage in Isaiah 6, verse by verse. We want to get all that God has here for us, and He has a lot for us. This is Isaiah's account of his initial call into ministry, his call from God to become a prophet. Although it doesn't show up in the book of Isaiah until here in chapter 6, this is where Isaiah's ministry actually began. This is where he began serving God as a prophet and was called to be a prophet. Verse 1 says that God gave him this vision, called him into ministry in the year that King Uzziah died. Back in Isaiah's day, and even well into the New Testament and beyond it, people didn't have calendars as we do today that specified particular years, distinguished one year from another. And so whenever they wanted to tell about something that happened in a particular year, the best that they could do was say something like, well, it happened in the year that so-and-so happened. And that's what Isaiah is doing here. But there's more to it than just that. Listen to this quote by Alexander MacLaren, who was a Scottish pastor back in the 1800s. I think he explains it really well. He says, in the year that King Uzziah died is a great deal more than a date for chronological purposes. It tells us not only the when, but also the why of the vision. The earthly king was laid in the grave, talking about Uzziah. But the prophet saw that the true king of Israel was the Lord of hosts. And seeing that, fears and forebodings and anxieties and the sense of loss all vanished, and new strength came to Isaiah. So, in other words, Isaiah said that in a time when things were really bad, God gave me this great vision of God. Uzziah was king over the nation of Judah. And he was a good king in a lot of ways. The people of Judah prospered under his reign. But in the latter years of Uzziah's reign, pride got the best of him. His success went to his head. And so 2 Chronicles 26 says that in his later years, God struck Uzziah with leprosy as punishment, and he died. And so his death left the nation of Judah just kind of reeling and saying, oh no, what's going to happen now? Our king is gone. And it was kind of like a lot of people in the United States felt back in the 60s when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The president has been killed. What's going to happen? And the nation was just devastated. That's pretty much how things were in Judah at the time that this happened. And so in a way, Isaiah is saying, in a really, really bad year, when everything seemed to be falling apart and everybody was anxious and apprehensive about the future, God gave me this incredible vision of himself. Isaiah says here, he says, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Now, can you imagine how incredibly encouraging for Isaiah that must have been? You know that it was. Everything was falling apart around Isaiah, but God showed him a vision of a place where nothing was falling apart. And he showed Isaiah that he was still on the throne and that his sovereignty and his control over all things, his power, were all unaffected by what was going on in Isaiah's life and in the lives of the people of Judah. And so there's some things in here, in this vision, that I think God wants to give us that can encourage us and help us deepen our commitment to Christ and our walk with God. Here's the first thing I want to notice. And if you have your note sheet printed out, you want to jot this down. First of all, this gives us assurance. Assurance that God is God no matter what is happening where we are here on earth. God is God, and He's unaffected by worldly crises and calamities. Back in the last chapter, the chapter previous to where we are here, chapter 5, Isaiah says in the very last verse of chapter 5, verse 30, right before he describes the vision, he says, and if one looks at the land, looks around, he will see darkness and distress. The light will be darkened by the clouds. That was Judah's outlook at the time Isaiah received this vision. Remember, Judah was coming under the judgment of God at this time because of their sin. And so things were bad, and they were about to get a lot worse. But this vision assured Isaiah that God was still on the throne, that none of that had changed. God was still in charge. And I think that message is something that you and I need to receive right here today. You know, we're in the middle of this coronavirus thing, and people are being laid off or maybe even losing their jobs. The stock market is doing really poorly. People are losing lots of money right now. Hundreds of thousands of people in America are becoming sick with this virus, and many of them are dying. And so this is a good time for God to remind us, reassure us, that He is still God. And that's true no matter what is happening here where we are on earth. Isaiah goes on in verse 2, and he says, above him, as I saw Christ there on the throne, above him were seraphs. Seraphs are a category of angelic beings. And they never appear on earth anywhere in the Bible, only in heaven. And Isaiah says that each had 6 wings. With 2 wings, they covered their faces, again, so that they wouldn't see the full glory of God. With 2, they covered their feet, and with 2, they were flying. I looked it up, and the Hebrew word that's translated seraph in our English Bibles basically means to burn. And I think that speaks of the brilliance and the brightness of the seraph's appearance. If you saw them, you would probably have to cover your eyes because they were gleaming with supernatural light. And they're not mentioned any other place in the Bible, only here in Isaiah chapter 6. And verse 4 says, "At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke." When they spoke, it was like a squadron of fighter jets flying overhead, breaking the sound barrier. Some of us remember and experiences like that we've had. It just the windows rattle. That's how powerful they were, and they are today in heaven. And yet, even they could not look directly at the Lord. That's because that would have been too much even for them. And just imagine what that says to us about God, about Christ. God is so powerful and so holy that even the angelic beings have to hide their faces. It just blows my mind. We cannot possibly imagine how holy and awesome God really is. Well, what were the seraphs saying to each other? It says that they were calling back and forth to each other. Well, verse 3 says, "And they were calling to one another, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is filled with His glory.'" And so they were praising God for His holiness. And you know, God's holiness is His signature attribute. Holiness defines God more than anything else about Him. And God's holiness is what puts Him in a class totally by Himself. Nothing in all creation is as holy as God is. And that scene that Isaiah is describing there goes on up in heaven 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, eternally. It never stops. The angelic beings, the seraphs and other angels are up there praising God even right at this moment. And God is God, no matter what happens here on earth. That's the bottom line I think we can take from that. You know, Psalm 90 verse 2, I think captures what I'm trying to say here. That verse says, "From everlasting to everlasting, you are God." Meaning, from eternity past to eternity present, you are God, and nothing threatens you. You're never going to not be God. You will always be God. That's so reassuring to know that. Even when Judah loses their king, and even when America gets shut down by a pandemic, God is still God, no matter what happens here on earth. I'm so glad to know that's true. Let's all remember that when we're inclined to worry and fret and lose our peace. And then in verse 5, there's something else that this vision of Isaiah gives us, and it's this. It's awareness of our sin and our utter inadequacy. Our inadequacy to stand before God because we're sinners. I get that from how Isaiah responded to what he saw, how it affected him. It made Isaiah intensely aware of his own sinfulness. In verse 5, he said, "Woe is me," I cried. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." And that fits a pattern, that description of what Isaiah said, how he responded to the vision, fits a pattern that runs all the way through the Bible. Anytime in the Bible that people are given even a glimpse of God in His heavenly glory, they fell apart. And that's because they became utterly aware and conscious of their sinfulness before the holiness of God. And so they just became weak in the knees. They collapsed. That's what happened with Isaiah. He realized how totally sinful and inadequate he was in the presence of Almighty God. You know, really this whole description in verses 1 to 5 come down to just two things that Isaiah says happened. Number 1, verse 1, I saw the Lord. And then in verse 5, woe to me, I said. I saw God, and I instantly became overcome with consciousness of my sin. Woe to me. That's what this really comes down to. You know, it makes me think, every now and then we today hear stories of people who claim to have had a visitation from God the Father or Jesus. And John MacArthur describes a time when he had lunch. He sat down to lunch with a famous charismatic televangelist. And during lunch, this televangelist told MacArthur that whenever he shaved in the morning, Jesus would come into the bathroom and put his arm around him and they would talk. And he looked at MacArthur and he said, do you believe that? And MacArthur looked him straight in the eye and said, no, I don't believe a word of it. And MacArthur told him, and I'm just reading straight from what MacArthur writes about this encounter. He said, I wonder, does he keep on shaving? Or does he collapse in utter fear and trembling in the presence of the holy, glorified Lord? When Isaiah saw the Lord on his throne, he said, woe is me, for I am ruined. Peter saw him and fell on his face and said, depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. MacArthur said, I don't believe anyone could keep shaving in the presence of the risen Lord. And I think MacArthur's exactly right about that. The Bible teaches that whenever a person, any person, encounters God, he or she instantly becomes overcome with awareness of his utter sinfulness and the utter holiness of God. And that's not a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. We need to be reminded of our sinfulness and of our inadequacy, because otherwise we would never be able to really see God as He is, and we'd never be able to see ourselves as we are. And so whenever God breaks us by showing us our sinfulness, that's really a gift from God. A gift that helps to prepare us to do what we need to do to become right with God. Things that we would never think to do otherwise. And that leads right into the third thing that this vision of Isaiah gives us, or should produce in us, and that is gratitude for Christ, who has made it possible for us to have a relationship with God despite our inadequacy. I am so thankful that Christ did what He did for all of us on the cross, because if He had not, if He'd not gone to the cross and died there and then been raised to life again, you and I would have no hope of ever connecting with God. Just think about that for a moment, and it'll make you really appreciate what Christ did for us. Christ would be, or God the Father rather, would be totally and eternally inaccessible to us if it were not for Christ's death and resurrection. And so we can be so grateful for Christ coming to earth and doing what He did on our behalf. Jesus made it possible for us to be restored to a right relationship with God. And that's a big thing. That's a wonderful thing. You know, Hebrews 10 verse 22 is an invitation. And it says, let us draw near to God with sincere faith, sincere heart, and full assurance of faith. And so it's a call to us. It's, come on, let's draw near to God. But it would be impossible for us to draw near to God the Father if it were not for what Christ did for us. And so as we read this account of Isaiah's vision of Christ in heaven, his holiness, it makes us appreciate what Christ did when Christ came to earth. And I'm so thankful that he did. But you know, of course, if you have never personally put your faith in Jesus Christ to save you, if you've never been born again, then none of this can apply to you. And so I encourage you to make sure that you have been born again, that you have put your faith in Jesus, that you have repented and turned away from your sin and been born again through saving faith. I encourage you to make sure that you've taken care of that. You know, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18 says, Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. Now just think about that for a moment. What Jesus did in dying and being raised again was he made it possible for you to be brought to God, to be restored to a right relationship with God. And like we've been saying, there would be no chance of that had Christ not died and been raised again. And so if you've never been born again, why wait? Why not take advantage of the relationship that Christ has made possible for you? I really encourage you to do that if you haven't. And if you are a believer, I want you to think about how your view of God, how you see God in your mind, how you understand God, what you understand God to be like and who he is. I want you to think about how that view of yours of God compares to Isaiah's vision of God in Isaiah chapter 6. Do they match? Do you really see God in a biblical light? I hope that you do. A.W. Tozer, who's a great man of God, pastor, writer years ago, he said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And he's absolutely right about that, because what we think about God shapes and determines what we think about everything else and how we see life, how we see ourselves. So there's nothing more important about us than our view of God. So just think about how you view God personally, how you understand God, what you understand God to be. Every single one of us could use some help in coming to understand God and understanding life and better. And we could use some help in how we respond to events and circumstances that come along in life. And is it possible that Isaiah is telling all of us, myself included in this chapter, that we need to raise our vision of God just a little bit, maybe a lot? Maybe we need to come to see God as he truly is, and that is the awesome God that defies description, that's just off the scale in terms of our imagination. He truly is our awesome God, and we want to make sure that we understand that. And if you'll spend some time with God in prayer, thinking about that and asking God to help you with those things, that'll be time well spent. And on your note sheet, I've included a supplemental section that's based on Hebrews 10, verses 19 to 25. It covers some things that Hebrews tells us that every one of us who's already a Christian should be doing on a regular basis to take full advantage of this relationship with God the Father that Christ has made possible for us. And so I encourage you, when you turn off the video, to spend some time looking at that section and asking God to help you do those things it talks about on a regular basis. And let me share now a special announcement with you. You know, April the 10th is Good Friday. It's the day that Christians all over the world remember Jesus' death on the cross. And we're not going to be able to have our traditional Good Friday service that we do here every year at Crowfield. And so what I plan to do is I'm going to videotape a special Good Friday message. And I encourage you to watch that message on Friday, if at all possible, maybe with your entire family. I think you'll find it to be a good way to remember the great gift of Christ's death and what that death of His means for every one of us. And so in the meantime, stay healthy and take care. Keep God in the center of everything in your life. And I am so looking forward to seeing you again. I hope that's going to be real soon. Goodbye.